All right, guys. Good afternoon. Could you drop a couple highs in the chat if you can hear me? That'd be very helpful. Hi, guys. Do please drop a couple highs if you can hear me. But I'm very excited to be introducing Stephanie Higa this afternoon. Stephanie is a senior software engineering at Box, who took a unique path to reach where she is. After graduating with a degree in architecture, she taught herself how to code at night while working a business development role for a tech incubator. She'll be sharing insights from her 8+ years of her journey and experiences as a front-end engineer in Silicon Valley. And she'll be telling us what front-end engineers really do and why you want to become one too. I'm very excited for this talk, and I'm excited to learn more from Stephanie.
Thank you so much for that nice introduction, CUSEC, and thanks everybody for joining me today. So again, my name is Stephanie Higa, and I'm a senior software engineer at Box in Redwood City, California. And I've been a front-end engineer for about 8 years now. I've worked at a number of companies in Silicon Valley and Los Angeles, and I'm looking forward to sharing with you the insights that I've picked up over the years so that I can help you figure out whether you might also be interested in becoming a front-end engineer. So quick agenda for my talk. I'm going to start off by talking about what front-end engineering is. Then I'm going to talk about why it's challenging. Then I'm going to talk about why it's rewarding and fun. And finally, I'll wrap up with some tips on what to look for in a front-end role. So let's begin with the definition of what front-end engineering encompasses. In the realm of web development, the front-end refers to the presentation layer, so the user interface, everything you see and everything you interact with. And if you're just building a simple website, like maybe a marketing page or even a static blog, the front end might be all that you need. But if you need dynamic data for your website, then you will also need a backend. So the backend is the data layer. It holds all the data for your application. The front end will send requests for data to the backend. The backend will retrieve that data from the database and send it to the front end. So most modern web applications depend on both the front end and a backend. And because both sides of the stack can get pretty complex, most engineers choose to specialize in one or the other. And I want to share a little bit about how I currently work with my teammates, backend engineers, as well as our product managers and designers. So each product at Box begins with the product manager. The product manager will define the requirements for the new feature based on customer interviews or maybe looking at data. And then they'll work with the UI UX designer to create mocks. So the UI UX designer is responsible for coming up with what the feature will look like and how it will behave. And the product manager will also work with the backend engineer to determine what kind of data we need to power the feature. The backend engineer will then go on to create the API and any database-related services. So my role as the front-end engineer is to tie all of these parts together. So I will get mocks from the UI UX designer, and then I will translate them into code. So I have to make sure that the user interface that I build looks as close as possible to what the designer has given to me. We call this pixel perfect design. And at the same time, I will also be connecting this new user interface to the API that the backend engineer has built. So this is a really fun process. There's a lot of collaboration at each stage. And there's a really nice separation of concerns. So I don't need to worry about the product. I don't need to worry about the design or any of the APIs. I just need to worry about creating the best user interface possible. So let's take a look at what goes into creating a modern web app from the front end side. When I started out, front end used to be a lot simpler. So we would have HTML for structure, CSS for styling, JavaScript, and jQuery. So jQuery, if you haven't used it, is like syntactic sugar over vanilla JavaScript. Many people find it to be easier to use. And it's actually still the most popular JavaScript library on the internet today. So we also used PHP for WordPress theme development, which I was doing a lot of. And before HTML added native support for videos, most people created their videos using ActionScript and Flash. But now, front-end looks more like this. So we have our JavaScript frameworks, which allow us to create single-page applications. And I'll go into some detail about what that means in a little bit. So in addition to the framework, we also have HTML5 and CSS3, which are the latest versions of HTML5 and CSS. And we also have CSS preprocessors to help us write CSS more efficiently for large applications. And then we might use TypeScript if we want strong typing in our JavaScript. And on top of this, we use a lot of other libraries. So most web apps depend on a ton of external open source libraries, and this is because it's often a better use of your time to use something that has been vetted by the community than to try to reinvent the wheel yourself. So then we'll usually need a polyfill for compatibility to make sure that our app looks good in different browsers, and then we'll need a compiler to consume those polyfills. And then we need to wrap all this up into a build system. So the front-end landscape has changed quite a lot in just a few years. But how did this happen? So to answer this question, we'll need to look a little bit closer into the evolution of JavaScript. So JavaScript was invented in 1995 for a browser called Netscape Navigator. And at the time, Netscape was embroiled in these browser wars with Microsoft. So in 1996, Microsoft reverse engineered JavaScript and created something called JScript, and they bundled that with Internet Explorer. So as you can probably guess, Microsoft won these particular browser wars, and Internet Explorer became the de facto browser in most people's homes and offices. And this led to kind of the dark ages of front end. Not much was happening. But in 2004, Mozilla, which spun out of Netscape, released the Firefox browser. And this was really well received by the community, and it was open source. So this led to a renaissance in front end. In 2005, the concept of AJAX became popular, and this just stands for asynchronous JavaScript with XML. It's the idea that you can run JavaScript in the background of a page without interfering what the user is looking at. In 2006, jQuery was first released, along with a lot of other popular JavaScript libraries. And in 2008, Google released the Chrome browser. And this was the first browser to use the V8 JavaScript engine, which allowed Chrome to render JavaScript much more efficiently than any other browser at the time. So in 2009, all these disparate parties came together and created the ECMAScript 5 standard, the first standard for JavaScript, and we call it ES5 for short. So this was really what took JavaScript from being a simple scripting language made for one browser to the language that is now ubiquitous on the internet. And all browsers nowadays support ES5. In 2015, front-end engineers got a gift called ECMAScript 6, or ES6 for short, and this added on a lot of really cool new features into JavaScript. So ES6 is really a joy to use. And ever since then, each year since 2015, there's been a new version of ECMAScript released. But the difference between all of those versions is pretty small compared to the difference between ES5 and ES6. So because JavaScript got so much more powerful, single-page apps became the norm. A single-page app is essentially an application that is contained within a single HTML page. The JavaScript framework that you use manages the view changes within this page. So this leads to fewer page refreshes and ultimately a smoother user experience. So you can imagine that creating a single-page app with dynamic view changes is much more complex than creating, say, a collection of static HTML pages. And this is the state of front-end today. So why is front-end engineering challenging? Well, a few things come to mind. One is keeping up with trends. So as we've just seen, front-end changes so quickly. So my own learning journey encapsulates this fact. I taught myself how to code in 2012. The first project I was ever paid to build was a WordPress theme using jQuery. In 2014, I learned AngularJS, which was the first version of Google's Angular framework. I was also doing some Ruby on Rails development with YAML templates. In 2016, I learned React, which is a really popular framework, and I was also using Redux, which is for state management. So at the time, many people were using React and Redux together. And this knowledge stayed current for a few years. And in 2019, people started depending less on Redux and doing more of their state management within React itself. So I started following that trend as well. In 2020, last year, I learned React hooks, which is just a new way of writing React components. And this year, I'm not really sure what I'm going to learn. I have a pretty long list, and I'm looking forward to seeing what I learn next. So I follow a few different resources to keep up with trends in the industry. So I follow these two newsletters, Color and Tech and Women Who Code. They are both great resources for just keeping up with the general tech industry and with a focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And as for websites, CSS Tricks, A List Apart, and Smashing Magazine are all really amazing front-end magazines. MDN Web Docs have extensive documentation and tutorials for anything related to front-end. And Hacker News is just really cool because people post things that are of general interest to people in tech. So the important thing to remember with all these changes is that fundamentals are key. So most frameworks follow similar design patterns. React and Redux follow a pub/sub design pattern, and Vue.js and Angular, which are two other really popular JavaScript frameworks, follow the model view model design pattern. And all JavaScript libraries compile to vanilla JavaScript. All CSS preprocessors compile to pure CSS. So if you know your JavaScript and CSS really well, then it won't be that difficult to pick up a new library that's based on those technologies. So another challenge that I face as a front-end engineer is setting up the development environment. So as we've seen, there's a lot that goes into creating a web app. We have our JavaScript frameworks. Again, these are React, Vue.js, and Angular, the three most popular frameworks. But in addition to our framework, we also need to have a package manager. So the package manager allows us to download the framework of our choice, along with any other libraries that our app depends on. I normally use Yarn these days, but previously I've also used NPM. And a compiler is also necessary if we want to use the latest ES6 and beyond features. So Babel is a really popular one, and what it does is it will turn all of your ES6 code into ES5 code that can then be rendered in even non-standards compliant browsers. And then we need a build system. I usually use Webpack, and what this does is it will take all of our application code and all of our library code and convert it into flat HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files, which we can then serve to the end user. So all of these libraries have a learning curve, and there's extensive documentation. And it can be really overwhelming if you're just trying to learn React, for instance. So fortunately, there are a few tools that we can use to simplify the setup for an app. So since I primarily develop with React, I often use Create React App to start new projects. And this is another project from Facebook that just allows you to build a new React app with Webpack and Babel built in. So you can just focus on writing the React code. I haven't used the Vue CLI, but I've heard that it does something really similar for Vue.js apps. And the Angular Stacklets app is pretty cool because even though it doesn't come with Webpack and Babel, you can create an Angular app right inside of your browser and just focus on the Angular code. So another big challenge that I face is supporting multiple browsers and viewports. I would say that this is the bane of every front-end engineer's existence. So let's take a look at what this means to support different browsers to start. So I normally do my development in Chrome and Firefox, and these are both standards compliant browsers. So my apps will generally look just as I expect them to. So this is pretty normal, a pretty normal experience to have your apps look correct in a standards compliant browser. But maybe one day I'll open up my app in a non-standards compliant browser like Internet Explorer 11, for instance, and things will look a little bit different, or maybe my app won't even show up at all. So these pictures are exaggerated, but it's a really common problem, and it can be really frustrating and really difficult to debug. But it's also important because we do have a lot of users who are still on IE11 and the old Edge, and we want to be able to support them. So we also have to be concerned about different viewports because, of course, I do my development on a computer, but I also need to make sure that my apps look good on tablets and on phones because more and more people are browsing the internet mostly or exclusively on their mobile devices, and we also need to support those users. So what are some tools that we can use for testing in multiple environments? Well, first of all, I think we should just figure out which environments we want to support. Like if you decide you don't want to support Internet Explorer 11, you don't have to. It just so happens that at Box, we do support IE11 and the old Edge. So I have to make sure that I'm supporting those users. So once we know which environments we're looking into, then we can figure out the tools to use. So for viewports, both Firefox and Chrome have these pretty cool built-in responsive views. If you go into the developer tools and click on the little icon of the tablet and the phone, you can see what your app will look like at different viewport sizes. And for testing out different browsers, you can use a virtual machine. So I personally do my development on a Mac, and I have a Windows virtual machine that allows me to test in IE11 and Edge. And there's also a really cool tool called Browser Stack that provides cross-browser and cross-device testing. However, it does cost money, and because even though it's mostly accurate, it's not completely accurate because you're testing through a proxy and you're not testing directly in that environment. So really the only way to see what your app looks like in a particular browser or a particular viewport is to actually test it in that environment. So despite all these challenges, why do I find front-end engineering to be fun and rewarding? So many things come to mind here. One is the instant visual feedback. So I'm a very visual person. I've done art for most of my life. I studied architecture in college. So it's really fun to me to be able to just change parts of my code, refresh the browser, and see things change. So I'm going to give a really simple CSS-based example here, but let's just say that this is my app and the designer has specified that we're going to have a pink background. So, and that's fine. And then one day the designer is like, actually, we decided that the background should be green instead. And all I need to do is just change one thing, refresh, and there we have it, a green background. So this is the essence of front end for me. It's really fun, and it's kind of like creating art inside of my browser. Another thing that I really love about being a front-end engineer is having the opportunity to shape the user experience. And to demonstrate what I mean by this, let's take a look at these screenshots. So these are 6 of the most popular websites on the internet, but they are completely unrecognizable without their distinctive front ends. So I feel that front-end engineers have this amazing opportunity to translate complex, powerful backends into a language that users can understand and create these experiences that people will want to keep coming back to. And last but not least, there's really strong career growth in front end. So I've taken these numbers from a couple of different surveys from Hire.com and Glassdoor, but there was a 17% growth in the demand for front engineers in 2020. And Glassdoor listed front-end engineer as #1 on its 50 best jobs list for 2020. And this list is based on earnings potential, number of job openings, and overall job satisfaction. Let's take a deeper dive into front-end languages in 2020. So again, these are from a few surveys that I found online, from Stack Overflow, GitHub, and Hire.com again. So JavaScript has actually been the most popular language among engineers for the last 8 years. HTML and CSS aren't far behind, and TypeScript is quickly gaining in popularity. So last year it edged out C on the Stack Overflow popularity list. If you haven't used TypeScript, it's a superset of JavaScript with strong typing. And I couldn't fit it into this table, but Stack Overflow also found that TypeScript was the 2nd most loved programming language. And it is a truly wonderful language to use. So if you're interested in becoming a front-end engineer, if all this sounds interesting to you, then what do you want to look for in a front-end role? So here are things that I found to be a good barometer for figuring out whether a front-end role is good. So first is support for modern front-end libraries. As we've seen, the front-end landscape changes so quickly. So if you're working at a company that is using outdated technologies, then your skills will also become outdated, and it will become that much more difficult for you to find your next job. So you want to look for a company that's either using the latest libraries or has a plan in place to migrate to them. Another thing to look for is a focus on user experience. How do you tell if a company cares about user experience? Well, an easy way is to check out their website and their apps. Do you like using them? Then the company probably does care about user experience. And during your interview, you want to make sure to look for a separation between design and front-end engineering. So make sure that they have a separate designer and they're not expecting front-end engineers to do the design. Make sure that the company has a team of designers and not just one designer, and they have a solid design process in place. And also look for equal opportunities for front-end and back-end engineers. So this is becoming less common. But previously, it was very for companies to be front-end engineers and give them fewer opportunities for career growth, which is very sad because, as we've seen, both the front end and the back end are essential to the success of a web app. So definitely look for a company that treats their front end and back end engineers equally. I'm really fortunate to have all of these things at Box. So my title is Senior Software Engineer. It has nothing to do with which stack I work on. And people also have the opportunity to change the side of the stack they work on depending on how their interests evolve. So I've talked a lot about front end and back end, and you might be wondering, well, what about full stack engineers, people who are amazing at both front end and back end? And certainly they do exist, but they're very, very rare. Most people choose to devote careers to one side of the stack, and that's because there's just so much to learn in both front end and back end. So this is reflected in the job openings as well. There are fewer full stack job openings at the senior and above levels. But the good news is that JavaScript is relevant on both sides of the stack. So you can, of course, use JavaScript on the front end, but you can also use it on the back end with Node.js. So I recommend trying out both front end and back end to see which one you like more. For me personally, I have done front end for pretty much my entire career as an engineer. There have been times where I've delved into back end, and while I found it to be really interesting, I've also found that it wasn't for me, and that I'm much happier doing front end, and it just fits better with my interests. And you may find that this will be the case for you too. So please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. You can find me on GitHub and LinkedIn. And I will also be in this call for a few more minutes, and I'll be at the VIP room tomorrow. So yeah, please feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for your time, and thanks for spending part of your day with me.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for sharing the various methodologies and technologies surrounding front-end engineering. I really enjoyed your talk, and I learned some really useful information. Thank you very much. And now let's move on to a couple questions. So please drop some questions in the chat if you have any. I guess a good question I had for you, or a quick one, was, is there, at some point, did you want to incorporate being a designer into your role of being a front end? Because I realized that you did study architecture, and you were saying how you did like to see things change. So yeah, that'd be great to hear about.
Yeah, that's a great question, Kisenge. So I actually was a designer for a little bit. So my career path is pretty complicated. So I started out doing business development and marketing for a tech incubator, and then I started working with designers who were located in other countries. So I was kind of just the liaison between the business development people and our external designers. And then one day we happened to work with a designer who didn't write any code, so he just sent me the mock-ups. And so at the time, that's really how I started making my first WordPress, my first WordPress theme for this company. But I was also doing a lot of design work on the side. So I was also creating marketing collateral, and then I started doing design. I started designing websites and writing the code for them. So when I left my first company, I was actually the only designer and the only front-end developer there.
Okay, that's pretty neat. Another question, we actually have a bunch here. Is portfolio important for front-end engineering, I guess, in what you've seen?
A portfolio in terms of UI UX design, or portfolio in terms of like a GitHub portfolio?
The question did not specify, but
okay.
Yeah.
I would say yes, the GitHub portfolio is really important. You want to make sure that you have an example of, say, like a React app that you've built. But generally, companies will give you more front-end focused questions, and they'll be able to figure out, like, they'll get a sense of your coding abilities during the interview. So, of course, the interview matters more than a portfolio.
Okay. And I think you talked about it a little bit during your talk, but what's your opinion on full stack development?
So
that's one of the questions.
I think full stack is great. if you don't have a strong preference for one or the other. So for me personally, again, because of my background and my interests, I've always found it natural to just go into front end. But if you think that like both might be good for you, then I would definitely recommend trying out a full stack role at the beginning and then specializing afterward.
Okay. And throughout your process, I guess you've learned a lot. But do you have any tips for college students trying to learn front end?
Yeah, so there are lots of internships that will focus on front end. So I know like at the Box internship, people can choose to do back end, they can choose to do more front end or full stack. So we have like a bunch of different opportunities. So when you're looking for an internship, look for either a front end or full stack role. And you might also want to try like building your own projects on the side.
Okay. So a question we have, so I guess you're saying you decided to learn coding after architecture, I guess mainly due to work, but did you consider learning code before doing architecture or while, or was it a brand new idea for you to pick up?
Great question. So I graduated into the recession. The housing industry had completely collapsed. So there weren't that many jobs in architecture. So I kind of knew early on that I wasn't going to be an architect. And I'd done some marketing internships throughout college. So that's why I decided to work at the tech incubator doing marketing business development. And I became interested in coding very quickly because I realized, hey, I'm like working in the tech industry and I want to learn how to make these products in addition to trying to sell them.
Right. Okay. Really pretty interesting question. Were there any translatable skills from architecture to being a front-end engineer?
Yeah, that is a good question. So I would say that there is some overlap, but it can be hard to see at first. So obviously, like having a strong visual sense is important in both fields. That's probably the biggest overlap. And the other thing that I see as being translatable is the fact that I spent most of my college years just like working on big projects and trying to like taking a project from conception to plan sections and models at the very end. And there is a similarity in terms of how I work on my current projects at work. So yeah, again, we'll have like lots of conversations with the project manager and the designer and the backend engineer. And we have to work together to take our projects from conception to completion.
Okay. And were there any difficulties you faced transitioning to front-end role?
Yes, many challenges. So because I didn't start learning to code until a few years after college. So I spent those years trying to learn how to code and really just not getting it. And it wasn't until I found this book on natural language processing with Python that it finally occurred to me, oh, okay, so this is another way of learning how to code. And that's what really stuck with me. And so after that, after I realized the basics of coding, then I had to go to my bosses at the time and convince them that I could write this WordPress theme for them. Okay. But fortunately, they were really nice people and they gave me the opportunity to try something new.
Nice. So it does look like we are out of time for questions here. But if you do have any and you have a VIP ticket, please feel free to ask Stephanie more. And thank you so much, Stephanie. I really enjoyed it. I'm sure lots of people enjoyed it too. And we definitely learned a lot.
Thank you, CUSEC, and thank you everybody for joining me today. It's really nice to be here with all of you.
All right, thank you guys. We're going to move over to the next event and stay excited, guys. All right.